Journeys of Hope. Life is a journey, and this is your spiritual passport. Where will the journey take us today? Let's walk together as we learn to become people of faith and hope.
Welcome to Journeys of Hope. I'm Angela Sealana, your guide for today's journey, and I serve as media coordinator for Pilgrim Center of Hope. Pilgrim Center of Hope, producer of this weekly radio and podcast program, is a nonprofit ministry founded in 1993 with a mission of guiding people to walk in hope with Christ and the church. As we journey through our daily lives, it's very likely that we'll encounter one of the nearly 2 billion people on earth who hold Islam as their faith. The popes of recent decades, including John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis, have all engaged in dialogue with Muslim leaders. On today's Journeys of Hope program, we will explore questions such as, what is every Catholic's theological relationship with Muslims? Where did Islam come from? What are some of the basic tenets of the Islamic faith? And what else is helpful for us Catholics to understand about Islam today? Well, joining us on this journey is Dr. Gabriel Said Reynolds, who specializes in the Quran, especially in relation to the Bible and Muslim-Christian relations. So thank you for joining us on Journeys of Hope, Gabriel.
Thank you, Angela. I'm really happy to be with you.
Well, I had the pleasure of meeting you during a consultancy at the University of Notre Dame, which is where you are a professor of Islamic studies and theology, teaching courses on theology, Muslim-Christian relations, and Islamic origins, as I understand it.
That's right, yes.
And I'd also like to note that you have taught internationally as well, including an intensive course in Jerusalem on the Holy Land at Notre Dame's Tantor Ecumenical Institute. And there's, much more to your fascinating work on the Bible and the Quran. I'm really sure that our friends are intrigued as they're listening about your background. So could you share a little bit with us about your personal background and what is it that got you interested in this field of Islam?
Thank you, Angela. It's really an honor and a pleasure to connect with you again. My background is not very interesting or exciting, so it won't be like, a dynamic and engaging starting point. I grew up in the suburbs in Connecticut. My family background's kind of mixed, all kind of different Christians and atheists and agnostics. Not a very religious family that I grew up in. I do have origins from my mother's side of the family from the Middle East, from great grandparents who came from Syria. And that led me as a college student, just out of curiosity, kind of there's this cool thing in the family background. It led me to travel to the Middle East. So somewhere in the early 90s, I traveled to Jordan and to Syria, found my distant cousins in Syria, and then I became very interested in understanding more about Islam. My cousins are Christian, of different Eastern Christian traditions. But Islam is just, you go to almost any Muslim majority country. It's a very public faith. Whether or not people are sort of really religious, it's still like, the Arabic language, for example, is saturated with religious expressions. You hear not only the call to prayer, but Quran recitation and the Friday sermon through loudspeakers. So it was this very, engaging, I almost had a sense of shock, like this overwhelming sense of this massive, powerful religious phenomenon. And that's what got me started in Islamic studies.
Wow. Yeah. Well, and another thing that, thank you for that background. I know that a lot of people in the U.S. don't really realize how rich the Eastern Christian tradition is, right? And that in the Middle East, that's where our faith actually began. So there are many, many Catholics and Christians of various traditions in the Middle East as well. So when you talk about your family background and having that Christian background from the Middle East, that's really rich. That's really a gift that you have. So even, if perhaps your, upbringing wasn't necessarily maybe the most religious, I'm sure that now as you have dived into, the religion of that part of the world, that perhaps that's become more of just a gift that you've realized over time.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I definitely didn't realize it before in my youth. And, it's like there's some cheesy romantic songs out there, where the guy is singing and he's telling the story of this lady who was just his friend. And then he realized years later, actually, she's like his perfect match, and how did he never see this? I can't think of one, but I think there's more than one. So yeah, it's a little bit like that. I mean, many Catholics, I think, experience that just generally, like, the beauty, the spiritual riches of the supernatural dimensions of our faith. I've just been going through the motions my whole life, and then something prompted me to rediscover my faith. And also with sort of, that element of my family background. So my grandfather, my Syrian grandfather, was from an Eastern Orthodox tradition, but the whole family had kind of had a division between those who remained Eastern Orthodox and those who became Eastern Catholic, because many Orthodox traditions in the East moved towards Catholicism in beginning in the 17th, I think, but more in the 18th and 19th centuries. So there were both of those traditions, so Eastern Orthodox and Eastern Catholic. And it's a really beautiful story because in terms of sort of disciplines, habits, and the way liturgy is celebrated, the Eastern Catholics and Eastern Orthodox are very, very close, almost identical. And so those Eastern Catholic churches not only give us an opportunity to discover some of the spiritual riches of the East, but they also act as a bridge to the Eastern Orthodox.
That's beautiful. Thank you. And it's so true. There is quite a richness in our faith. And, as for me, I really discovered that when I went to the Holy Land as a staff member of Pilgrim Center of Hope. And that was where I encountered Islam really for like the most that I ever had in my life.
Yes.
And we also visited Jordan on that trip as well. And I was very impressed by the way that Christians and Muslims cooperated there in that country, in particular, being a Muslim majority country and society. That was very new to me as a person living in the U.S., native born to the U.S. We have very limited exposure to Islam as a whole. And so when I was, one story that I love to tell that just tickles people, is so fascinating to them, that when I went to Cana in Galilee, we went to the church where Jesus turned the water into wine at the wedding. And we met a parishioner there who was a native Palestinian woman. And she mentioned that, Muslims actually joined them to pray the rosary at the church.
Wow.
Yeah. Beautiful. So they don't say, Mother of God because of their difference, right, in beliefs about Jesus. And we'll get into that as we discuss today. But in that, I learned that Muslims have a great reverence for Jesus and Mary, and that was something that I had no idea.
Beautiful.
Before.
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And there's different dimensions to the relations between Christians and Muslims. Some things which are distinct to the Holy Land, other things distinct to Jordan. So we could speak about that as well at some point. But yeah.
Yeah. So thank you again for kind of contributing so much of not only your personal background, also your academic background. Obviously, we're bringing in as well. And as a theologian, here in the U.S., we have Judeo-Christian roots for the most part, right? And most Catholics are, I would say, probably much more familiar with Judaism than Islam. And Islam is a lot more mysterious to most Americans. Would you give us kind of like a brief introduction? And I know that's sort of a loaded question, but maybe we can start with, what is the meaning of the word Islam and Muslim?
That's a great place. Yeah, terrific place to start. And as with Christianity, there's sort of two main aspects to cover in introducing Islam. One is sort of the theology. So what does Islam teach about God and God's relationship to humanity? And then the other is sort of the practice. Like, how do you be Muslim? What do you do on a typical day? On a Thursday, what do you do as a Muslim? So in terms of Theology, that word, as you, excuse me, as you alluded to, the word that became the name for the religion, Islam, is a really nice way of expressing the principles, theological convictions of Muslims. The word means submission. And so there's a real emphasis in the vision of God and humanity in Islam on sort of God as master and Lord, humans as his servants. And there's sort of this interest in cultivating a disposition of pious fear and reverence towards God. It's a complicated question, I would say, Angela, because spirituality changes, from person to person. So different Muslims have different sort of ways of articulating that notion of fear of God. Some really emphasize nearness to God, love of God. Many Muslims would say, hey guys, don't make a caricature of Islam. It's not that God is some tyrannical Lord and we're just sort of helpless slaves. No, there's intimacy and feeling. But for many Muslims, sort of the vocabulary of a human as servant, like the common Muslim name, Abdullah, which comes from two words in Arabic, abd, which means servant or slave, and Allah, which means God. So this is very common. Many other versions of that, like Abdul Jabbar, Abdul Nur, many other ways of emphasizing humans as servants to God. But God is also compassionate for Muslims. And so Muslims would really emphasize that God is watching out, sort of attentive to the human situation and intervenes in the world. So he's not just kind of sitting in heaven on a throne, just doing nothing. He looks at our condition and with love for us, he mercifully sends prophets. This is very important in Islam. We could speak more about some of the visions of particular prophets, but the fact that God sends prophets is an expression of his merciful nature. He seeks to guide humans. He wants humans to, most Muslims wouldn't say be saved, but to have the reward is more Islamic language of heaven. So he sends prophets to guide them. Sort of the second dimension is practice, which I could carry on and speaking a little bit about practice, but I don't want to keep on going on too long. So I could emphasize more something on theology or just continue to speak about Muslim practice if you'd like.
Well, thank you for all that you shared so far. And the interesting piece that I took away, first of all, about Islam is this idea of who God is to them. Mm-hmm. And it is the fact, and we'll get into this a little bit more, but the fact that the church, the Catholic Church, teaches that we do the Abrahamic faiths, and maybe you can speak a little bit about Abraham and what our theological relationship is, but that all the Abrahamic faiths do worship the one same God, even though we may have different ideas about who that God is. It's
a bit of a contentious issue among Christians and to some extent among Muslims, Angela, the question of do we worship the same God? Mm-hmm. The church, however, the Catholic Church is quite clear that the answer to that question is yes. Now, it's not ever really been sort of clearly dogmatically sort of promulgated that all Catholics must, as being a Catholic, you must affirm this, but in a sort of a way that guides, a sort of pastoral way that guides Catholics in two different Vatican II documents. It's been taught that we worship the same God, and the popes, you alluded to the recent popes in different ways, John Paul II, Benedict, and Francis, have all spoken of our common faith in the same God. And, there are good arguments why we should, in fact, even if it's not just a question of, let's say, discipline as a Catholic, respect of our church, just intellectually, there are good reasons to affirm we worship the same God. Having said that, however, there are different articulations of God's nature, and a really important point to note on this is that Muslims, when it comes to, so as theologians, we sometimes speak about two kinds of theology, right? There's natural theology. So those things we can know without sort of reading a scripture, Quran or Bible or anything else. So we have this in common, natural theology. But when it comes to supernatural theology, Muslims have different sources than Christians. As a rule, Muslims do not see the Bible to be a reliable source of supernatural revelation, much less do they, they also don't see church tradition as a reliable source of supernatural revelation. So they rely instead on the Quran and then a second body of texts that are connected to Muhammad called the Hadith. So there's different data. The Bible says certain things about God, the Quran says certain things about God, and they're not exactly the same. So there is sort of difference there, which can be a fruitful subject for dialogue.
And for those who, may be a little bit rusty on our Old Testament biblical theology, could you share a little bit about Abraham and what is his connection to all three of these faiths?
Sure. Yeah. So, the first, for me, the starting point when it comes to Abraham is the scriptures, as you said, Angela. So, let's be attentive to the presentation of Abraham in the Old Testament, but also how the church teaches us to read those passages, principally in Genesis. One thing that we probably should sort of set aside is a notion that really is simplistic, that Abraham sort of is the father of Jews and Christians through Isaac, and the father of Muslims through Ishmael. Now, Genesis does tell us that, he had those two sons. Ishmael comes first. It tells us the story, sort of mostly in Genesis 21, of Ishmael, Hagar, his mother, and Ishmael, and then tells us the story in much greater detail of Isaac. But, Christianity is not sort of genealogically descended from Abraham. Our faith is just that. It's a faith. We become Christians by baptism, not by being descended from Abraham through Isaac. Same thing with Muslims, except for the baptism part. If they don't become Muslims by somehow being genealogically connected to Abraham through Ishmael. So I don't know if that point's clear.
Sure,
because
yeah.
It's really tricky. We hear Abrahamic religions, and then we hear stories of Abraham and his two sons. Actually, they're more later on, but his two principal sons. And then we just connect those things naturally. So it's logical people would do that, but it really doesn't reflect the convictions of Christians and Muslims. Judaism is a little bit different because there's this element of the Jewish people descended, really from Jacob, the grandson of Abraham. Now, Abraham is super important to Islam. Angela, having said that, the Quran does speak extensively about Abraham. It tells some of the same stories and some different stories about Abraham. And one really kind of cool element of Abraham in Islam is, the famous pilgrimage that Muslims do to the city of Mecca, which is referred to with the Arabic term Hajj, Hajj. The Muslims argue that the things that believers do during that pilgrimage are done in imitation of what Abraham himself did. So it wasn't Muhammad who established the rites of the Islamic pilgrimage in Mecca. It was Abraham. Abraham went to Mecca. This is not in the Bible, right? So here's a point.
According to the Quran, right? Yes.
Exactly. Yeah. So Abraham went to Mecca, and all the various things which we could speak about if it's interesting. So all these different rites and traditional rituals that Muslims do during that pilgrimage. So they would connect all of those things to Abraham.
Well, thank you. That is in itself, I know people are learning a lot as they're listening to you. I appreciate how you're breaking things down. And as we were talking about the faith of Islam as a whole, you were talking about the popular names in among Islamic families, and that the word Allah is sort of integrated into a lot of those names. And I know for the average person who may know like a thing or two about Islam in the U.S., one of those things is that Muslims worship Allah, right? That they use that word for God very often.
Yeah.
And one thing that I just wanted to share, because we are talking about, us as Catholics and Christians and the beauty of our faith, is that my understanding, Gabriel, is that word Allah, as I encountered in the Holy Land among Christians who speak Arabic
Yes.
is that they also use the word Allah to
Yes.
speak to God and about God. So that is simply the Arabic word for God. Is that right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And to be fair to Christians and other non-Muslims in the U.S., a Muslim practice sort of complicates this and confuses things a bit because Muslims speaking in English, many love to keep the Arabic word Allah when speaking English. They still use that Arabic word, like there are some expressions people have from French or something that they use in English, like, RSVP or something. Yeah, Muslims love to say Allah, different reasons which we could speak about. And so you hear this, like, Muslim is saying like, Allah, is merciful, or may Allah forgive you. They're speaking English, but then they use Allah. So that sort of inculcates this idea that Allah is some other God or something. But you're right, if you go to Arabic-speaking countries where there are Christians and Muslims together, yeah, everyone says Allah. So, like very common. My wife is from Lebanon. We lived with our family and our children a couple of years in Lebanon. You'll be hanging out with Muslims, and that's the word for God. So, and you say it all the time because, someone gives you a cup of coffee, you say, oh, may God reward you, or may God bless you. And if it's Muslims and Christians together, say, may Allah bless you, may Allah reward you. So absolutely. And there's no, like, the idea that Allah would be a different God in an Arabic-speaking country is just nonsensical. It's just the word for God, simply.
Yeah. That's one of the things that I just really, really enjoyed about the Arabic-speaking countries that I visited, that there are so many of these sayings that have to do with God and using Allah. And one of the ones that I picked up on, maybe because I work at Pilgrim Center of Hope, is the term inshallah, which means God willing, if God wills it, or maybe even you could say hopefully, right? We hope for it. So that's something that I love to use, even though I don't get to use it very often because people don't know what it means. But
absolutely, yeah. I remember former President Biden said inshallah in one of his debates, and my Muslim friends on social media were like, "Oh, that's so cool! He said inshallah." Yeah. So there's a verse in the Quran which says that you should not sort of tell people that you're going to do this or that without adding inshallah, and without adding if God wills. And it's possible that that verse, amazingly, this is super cool. It's not the only case of this, Angela, that it's actually connected to something in the New Testament. I think it's in the letter of James. Someone might correct me, which says you shouldn't do this or that without saying if God wills. Of course, it's in Greek originally. So it could be the Quran is actually developing something that Christians were saying because of that verse in the New Testament. And now it's become very popular among Muslims, and Christians are sort of relearning it from Muslims, if that makes sense, even though it's actually there in the New Testament. So Christians shouldn't be like, that's Islamic or something, that's not cool, or even like, why did President Biden say that? I mean, it's probably originally from our own scripture. There's also a joke, to be a little bit less serious, that sometimes people will tell, which is like, if you're asking for something, if you need some paper from some office, or pick up laundry or something, and you're saying like, will I have it tomorrow? If someone says yes, you will have it tomorrow. If someone says inshallah, you're definitely not getting it tomorrow. It's just a way of saying it's going to take a few more days.
Well, this is all very good for us to know as we're interacting with our brothers and sisters who are coming in from different countries and speaking Arabic. So that's all good to know. These are cultural gems and jewels. And for those who you mentioned the relation between the New Testament of our Bible and Islam. So we just have a couple minutes before we go to break, but if you could set us up and tell us, refresh our memory, or let us know, what is the timeline as far as the emergence of Islam and the Christianity?
Yeah, great point. It's really important to keep these things in mind. Islam comes after Christianity. Muhammad lives about 600 years after Jesus. So the most of the various 27 books of the New Testament are written in the second half of the first century AD. By tradition, Muhammad is born in AD 570, and he begins to preach. Sort of his vocation as a prophet begins in AD 610. So centuries and centuries later, and then he'll die, according to the traditional date, in AD 632. So, the Quran comes afterwards, and maybe just one thing to add here briefly is that the Quran refers to some sort of revelation or book connected to Moses, and some sort of revelation or book connected to Jesus. There are even some passages of the Quran which suggest that it's good for Jews to rely on their book and Christians to rely on their book. So there are these sort of positive references. But there's also criticism, not only of Christian teaching, but also of the way that Jews and Christians possibly corrupted or falsified God's word. And this leads to a basically standard, almost universal doctrine later on among Muslims, that the Bible is not reliable, and it should not be read if one is seeking guidance from God. So that's one of the more complicated points of dialogue.
Well, we're here with Dr. Gabriel Said Reynolds from the University of Notre Dame, who is a scholar of Islam and the Bible, and we are talking about Islam. And so we as Catholics want to know what is important for us to know about this faith and what is our relationship to Muslims. We're learning a lot. We're learning about the Muslim holy book, the Quran, as well as the major prophet, Muhammad. And we will be learning in this next segment after our break about some of the practices of Islam and more background. So stay with us here on Journeys of Hope. This is Angela Sealana.
And I'm Jason Nunez.
We are two of the hosts of Journeys of Hope, the weekly radio broadcast and podcast program that brings you inspiring stories of faith, hope, and love from around the world. We have an important message today to share with you.
As we approach the 5th year of this program, because of you, we have been able to reach tens of thousands of people through podcasts and over the airwaves.
When we say that Pilgrim Center of Hope's programming is supported by God's grace and by you, we truly mean it. We're grateful for everyone who has supported us to make our mission possible since 1993. This effort of support and the need for support is ongoing. Presently, Pilgrim Center of Hope is seeking monthly supporters who want to help us continue our mission of guiding people to encounter Christ.
You can also make a difference by sponsoring a week of Journeys of Hope for only $50. You can dedicate a week of the program to a special person or organization of your choice.
This can be a spiritual gift, in honor or in memory of someone who has touched your life.
Your dedication will not only honor your loved one, but also join us in our mission of evangelization and spreading the good news of Jesus Christ to thousands of listeners.
Please consider becoming a monthly supporter of Pilgrim Center of Hope or dedicated Journeys of Hope program today. You can do so by visiting pilgrimcenterofhope.org and click How to Help. There you'll find a donation form. Or if you'd like to dedicate a Journeys of Hope program, you can do so on our wish list.
Feel free to call us at 210-521-3377 to discuss how you can partner with Pilgrim Center of Hope to continue guiding people to Christ. Thank you for your generosity, and as we say at Pilgrim Center of Hope, every little bit helps. May God bless you.
Welcome back to Journeys of Hope. Our journey today is a spiritual pilgrimage on the topic of Islam. What should Catholics know? Joining us on the way is Dr. Gabriel Said Reynolds of the University of Notre Dame, however you want to say it, tomato, tomato.
The original French pronunciation, Angela.
Yes, and professor of Islamic Studies and Theology. So thank you again for being so generous with your time.
Very happy to be with you.
So we spoke about some of the similarities, some of the differences between Catholicism, Christianity, and Islam in our first segment. One of the things that I really would like to talk about in this final segment is about some of the basic tenets of Islam. One of the things that we are coming to know here in the U.S. is that there are many young people that are fascinated by Islam because there are many concrete practices that are specified for Islamic Muslim practice. And so one of those things that I understand is a basic tenet of the faith of Islam is the declaration of faith. So kind of from a Catholic perspective, it sounds like a creed of sorts. But could you tell us a little bit about like what is that declaration of faith, and maybe a little bit about the Muslim belief in God that differs from our belief?
Terrific. Yes. So yeah, there famously 5 pillars of Islam. That idea comes from not the Quran itself, but from this second body of literature called the Hadith. And usually the first one named is, just as you said, Angela, is this profession of faith, that there's no God but God, and that Muhammad is the messenger of God. And it's this is what it takes to become a Muslim, to sort of proclaim publicly this profession of faith. And there are different sort of ideas about exactly what is required for that to sort of be ritually proper. Do you need witnesses? Do you have to say it in Arabic? Can you say it in your own language? So there's some debates about that. To be a Muslim means to profess faith in God alone, but also to acknowledge Muhammad. And it's not just lip service. That means submitting yourself to the teachings of Muhammad, to Sharia, to Islamic law.
Okay. And one of the things that I've personally been in dialogue with a Muslim before about was the Trinity, the Holy Trinity, and the understanding of the Trinity in Christianity, that for at least this particular gentleman that I was speaking with, and maybe you can dive into this a little bit more, but he definitely rejected the idea that there could be a Trinity. So could you speak a little bit to that?
This is a topic that almost inevitably comes up. It's like in the top, not the top 10, the top 3 or 4, when Muslims start a conversation on religion with Christianity. And it often puts Christians on the back foot, because in our daily life, in our walk with the Lord, we don't sit around usually talking about what is the intellectual, proof or defense of the doctrine of the Trinity. We just don't talk about it. The church tells us, that God has revealed himself as Father, Son, and Spirit. Christ himself used that language. The evangelists give us different indications that God has sort of unfolded his nature, and that this is his nature. We trust that. We trust the church, trust the Lord, and we sort of carry on with our other things. For Muslims, this is sort of, the principal place to begin to challenge Christians. And so oftentimes Muslims in conversations, they're ready to speak about this. They might have watched YouTube videos sort of modeling how to debate Christians about that, or they may just have goodwill and, know that the Quran itself, in various verses like chapter 4, verse 171, or chapter 5, verse 116 in the Quran seems to criticize the Trinity. And so, the basic point to make about this is that neither Islam nor Christianity is a philosophy. Okay. Both are religions. And that means what we know about God, above all, is what God has shown us of himself. Mm-hmm. Right? So Christians didn't sit around one day and say, wouldn't it be cool if God, were 3 persons, Father, Son, and Spirit? And, they just decided it. This is not how it works. So too, Islam, for example, has a vision of God sitting down on a throne, or speaks of God's spirit, or says that the Quran is uncreated, existed eternally with God. Muslims didn't sit around and come up with a vision of God sitting on a throne. This was, according to them, revealed to them by the Prophet Muhammad. So, I mean, for me, that's the most important point to make. Before jumping in and trying to explain, how God is one divine substance, but he's Father, Son, and Spirit, it's just important to emphasize that God himself has, it's like you meet a new person and kind of look like, just a person, and, kind of observe. They might have like a certain kind of style of clothing, walk in a certain way, talk in a certain way. And then they tell you something about themselves, I don't know, their cousin was a professional basketball player. You never would have known that by looking at them, only because that person has said, my cousin played in the NBA, right? So it's kind of that sort of thing with the Trinity. We believe that God is Father, Son, and Spirit because God has shared this with us.
Thank you for breaking that down. That makes so much sense. Is we dovetail off of that, another point that I know is something that Christians and Muslims often part ways on, definitely,
yes,
is the idea that Jesus was God and that he actually died on the cross for us. That for Muslims, that is, and I mean, to their credit, even for me as a Christian, is a very difficult concept to grasp. The idea that Jesus truly was God and truly did die. Anything you want to say to that point,
absolutely,
just to kind of help us?
Yeah, the danger is that I'll say too much. Angela, so you might have to cut me off. Incredibly important point. And once again, the starting point in conversations about this is, divine revelation. The first apostles, they were all of the apostles, they were faithful Jews whose sort of instinctual ideas about God were similar to what a Muslim might say today. That God is simply one and he's transcendent and other. And that's why it was so hard for them to imagine that God loved us so much that he actually took upon a human person and walked among us in Jesus. So think of the story of doubting Thomas, for example. And now with Muslims, part of the reason for their convictions about Jesus is the Quran itself says this. So, I mean, that means in part that Christians should have a really limited expectations in how far you can have a meeting of the minds with Muslim friends about this, right? Because the Quran itself says that Christians are wrong in saying that Jesus is the Son of God. So if they don't want to betray their own scripture, they actually cannot say, oh, I see that, you could be right about that. Like it's just not possible unless they move away from their trust in what the Quran says. I'm not sure if that point makes sense. Now, why does the Quran sort of double down on Jesus only being a human, refuse to call Jesus a son of God, even though it accepts the virgin birth of Jesus? And maybe it's kind of another point, so we can speak about this later or some other time, but maybe deny even that Jesus died on the cross. It's because Jesus, like the other prophets before Muhammad, in the Quran, his principal role is to sort of model prophethood in a way that helps the reader accept the argument that Muhammad is a prophet. So all of the prophets, Jesus and Noah, Abraham, Moses, and everyone else, they're in the Quran, they're basically act, talk, walk like Muhammad. So they're made to be sort of prototypes of Muhammad and Jesus as well. So necessarily, the idea that he's Emmanuel, God with us, or that he's a savior, it just doesn't work because the Quran wants Jesus to be like Muhammad.
Okay. So we definitely, I think, now understand more about the faith of Islam, at least in terms of the major differentiations between Islam and Catholic Christianity of our faith. So I know that another pillar of Islam that I find very similar to our traditional Catholicism is the role of prayer in Islam, that Muslims do have a a schedule almost of prayer. And we talked a little bit in the first segment about the call to prayer in Muslim majority countries, where you are just walking around during your day, and then you hear this really amazing call from this tower that is coming up, and many towers all together.
Call for more than one mosque.
Yes. So could you say a little bit about what is the role of prayer in Islam?
I'm actually interested in the question of sort of the use of loudspeakers in public space for the call to prayer and the Friday sermon and things. I'll resist the temptation to speak about that and focus just on prayer. And here, I think Catholics can learn a lot from Muslims. So, I think in some ways, for at least American Catholics, there's this sort of, very prevalent assumption that, really you should pray when you feel like it. You should, you kind of have autonomy over how you spend your time. So, even people who are, believe in God and, are Catholics, they may have this disposition of just like, if I don't go to Mass, if I don't pray every day, maybe next week I'll pray a lot, or maybe I'll do something that for me is prayer, like hugging my kid or something like that. That's a prayer. Or looking at a flower, smelling a flower, like that's my prayer. There's kind of this vibe, and Islam has a totally radically different vision of prayer. So prayer is part of a larger set of rules or norms that God basically imposes on humans, which provide humans, from a Muslim point of view, provide humans the opportunity to manifest their love for God by doing what he asks. It's that simple. If you love me, it's kind of like how Jesus speaks to Peter at the end of the Gospel of John. But there are many other, I think the prophet Samuel says somewhere in 1 Samuel to Saul, like, God doesn't want sacrifice. He wants obedience. So, this is the Islamic vision of all of the norms, including prayer. And I could speak more specifically about how Muslims pray and stuff like that. But God imposes these. It's not our role to say, like, if I feel like it, I'll do it. Rather, God demands that we pray 5 times a day in Arabic, facing a certain direction, with very, very particular detailed movements, not just prostrating to the ground, but the way you hold your hands, your feet, they may look like the same. They're actually a little bit different. You have to do one thing with one foot, one thing with, like, all of these. You should be attentive to this because God asks you to. And I think this is a lesson for Catholics. I mean, the sort of most low-key takeaway from that is, Christ established a church and established for us the Eucharist. Attendance at Sunday Mass is an obligation, not a choice. Obviously, there are exceptions if someone's sick, things like that, but it's an obligation, even if you don't feel like it. We have the responsibility to express our love for Christ by doing what he asks of us, by at least attending Mass on Sundays.
Yes, thank you for putting that into context. I think we can understand. And as you said, there are so many other nuances to prayer in Islam, just like in Catholicism. How could you begin to even describe? But one thing that you didn't mention is that Friday is an important day. Could you speak about why that is?
Yes, so it's a bit of a mystery. The Quran itself, there's a surah in the Quran, a chapter in the Quran, which is called the chapter of Friday. And there's a clear verse in the Quran which says that there's a moment when the community should gather on Friday. This is the noonday prayer of the 5 prayers, which is actually the second of the 5, but it's a noon prayer, when the community should gather together and pray. And it's actually only men who are sort of religiously required to attend the communal prayer in a mosque. Women have to pray as well, but it's either legitimate for them to pray at home or recommended for them to pray at home. There are different ideas about this. Those mosques that do have a space for women, they tend to have a strict division. So there's a men's side and a women's side, or women will be in the back. But yeah, why Friday was chosen, the Quran doesn't tell us. Most historians suggest that it was a way of distinguishing this new community from Christians who, of course, have their weekly required Mass on Sundays, and Jews who celebrate the Sabbath between sundown on Friday evening and sundown on Saturday evening. But that's a speculation. There's no sort of origin story that one finds in the Quran itself.
Mm. And as you're speaking about the schedule sort of for Islam, one of the major events for a Muslim that I'm aware of is Ramadan. And that is something that I think also as Catholics, we can have sort of, an allegory or something that is almost running together so that we understand what Ramadan is. Could you give us kind of a general summary of that?
Yes, the Quran speaks of Ramadan and the fasted Ramadan, and then later Muslim scholars develop sort of the particular rules about the fast of Ramadan, the origins of why this month and why you fast and why you fast and the way you fast are not really clear from a historical perspective. Most Muslims would say, well, Muhammad did it and he established the norms that we follow, and so it's pretty simple. A historian would say, well, maybe it's not that simple. And anyway, there's actually lots and lots of questions that Muslims debate, over the fast. I mean, simple things about like, when does day actually begin? It's actually a complicated question. Now, who says that this is day, this moment is day, this second is the day? Same thing, when does the night begin? So it could possibly reflect, and probably does, Christian practices of fasting in the East, which, as I'm sure you know, Angela, are much more strict than in the Latin Rite, the traditions of the Latin Rite. I mean, we have I'm not saying it's good or bad, I'm not casting any judgment.
Sure.
But we have like the easiest fast you could possibly imagine.
Roman Catholics have it really easy.
It's like if you were actually trying to come up with an easier fast, I don't know if you could basically give up meat on Fridays, 2 days of halfway fasting, Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, and then maybe give up, Sour Patch Kids for all of Lent. I mean, it's just so, but it's not the case among the Eastern traditions of Christianity that have very, very strict fasts. And many of those fasts are connected to times of day. So in some Eastern churches, for example, there's a strict fast until noon. And there are other traditions in the East which are connected specifically to sunrise and sunset. So most likely it came from that. But anyway, setting aside the questions of origins, it could actually be another opportunity where Christians can rediscover this sort of more reverent way of obeying God through a period of fasting, and not because for some sort of health question or whatever, it's good for the body because this is part of what God has asked of us. And the discipline with which Muslims are attentive to Ramadan and the communal aspect of Ramadan, because Muslims can eat and drink in the evenings and there's lots of parties and gatherings. It really brings the community together in a beautiful way, which, the way we do Lent doesn't always do that in the same degree. These are real lessons that Islam can teach us.
So we've talked about the declaration of faith. We've talked about the call to prayer and the role of prayer in Islam. We've talked about fasting. We've touched on the pilgrimage that Muslims are required to make to Mecca. And you mentioned in the first segment that was in a model of Abraham as spoken about in the Quran. So the other thing that the fifth pillar that I'm aware of in Islam is almsgiving, is acts of charity. And this is very, for how I've been exposed to Islam, I've really seen that Muslims are very focused on charity and almsgiving in a almost heroic way, in my opinion, very virtuous. Could you share a little bit about that pillar of the Islamic faith?
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many beautiful examples of Muslim Americans, for example, who, above and beyond the required almsgiving, according to Islam, sort of model, charity and benefaction. And we have many examples, in this here, I'm in Northern Indiana, Chicago area, of, hospitals, institutes, cancer centers, the main benefactor has been a Muslim. The Arabic word for almsgiving or for the alms is zakat. So it's usually written Z-A-K-A-T. That word in Arabic is related to the concept of purity and purification. It actually probably comes from another language originally, which is a language called Syriac, which is more or less Aramaic, the language of Christ himself. That word in Syriac Aramaic has to do with purity. And pretty clearly the concept, the way that purity can sort of be connected with almsgiving is this concept that has deep roots in the Bible, that through charity, we purify our own soul. And, there are beautiful stories. For example, the book of Tobit is kind of one of those treasures in the Bible that we don't always read, that really emphasize that through almsgiving, we have an opportunity of purification of the soul. The Quran loves sort of language about giving a loan to God, God giving you a reward, God purchasing your soul, and paying you with paradise for your soul. So this sort of almost, mercantile or a trade sort of language is really operative in articulating the relationship between God and humanity in the Quran, and it sort of orients us towards the treasure we can have in heaven, which of course is deeply evangelical language that we have from Christ in the Gospels. There's these two dimensions of almsgiving. One is the charity, loving one's neighbor, but the other dimension also is this interior dimension of purification.
Thank you. As you're speaking to us about Islam, thank you, Dr. Reynolds. I have seen how you are drawing these connections so that, perhaps when we have dialogue with our Muslim neighbors as Catholics, that we can find some common ground, that we can know sort of what are some of the differences, and we can ultimately learn from one another. There is a YouTube channel that you have recommended for those who want to learn more. Could you share a little bit about that project with us?
Thank you so much. Thanks for that opportunity. The YouTube channel is very simple. Reasons for Our Hope. Some will recognize where that phrase is coming. So Reasons for Our Hope is a project that was instigated and supported by both the Oasis Foundation in Milan, which was founded by Cardinal Scola, former Archbishop of Milan, Italy, and by the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. So this project is coming from the heart of the church, and as visitors to, and hopefully subscribers to the channel Reasons for Our Hope on YouTube will discover, it offers really short, simple, but beautiful videos, most of them being animated, which present key questions about Islam and the church. And the videos, they offer sort of very simple and clear presentation of the differences between Islam and Christianity in a way that is not polemical, not confrontational, but is also sort of honest about, how do Muslims see God? How do Muslims live their life? What can Christians learn from this? How, through Islam, can they rediscover the beauties of the gospel in the church? So, I would really encourage folks to see what Notre Dame and the Archdiocese of Milan have put together on Reasons for Our Hope.
Well, thank you for all of your work and your good work in building bridges, and helping us to understand our neighbors. And I appreciate everything that you're doing, everything that you will continue to do. So God bless you in your work, Dr. Reynolds.
Thank you so much, Angela. I need prayers because get a lot of things wrong, mess up a lot of things, but we'll carry on with God's grace. And thank you for all the work you do through this program.
If you're interested in the resource that Dr. Reynolds has recommended and learning more about the Catholic Church's teaching on Islam, visit Pilgrim Center of Hope's website at pilgrimcenterofhope.org. That's pilgrimcenterofhope.org. And look for our Journeys of Hope Media archive. On the page corresponding to this episode, we'll provide you with links for further discovery, and you'll also be able to learn more about today's guest, Dr. Gabriel Said Reynolds. Well, this brings us to our jewel for the journey. As is our tradition, we want to give you a jewel for the journey, a spiritual gem you can reflect on throughout the week. And this week we reflect on the words of Pope St. John Paul II, who in an address to Muslim leaders in Belgium said this: "It is a good thing to come to understand each other by learning to accept differences, by overcoming prejudices and mutual respect, and by working together for reconciliation and service to the lowliest." Fellow pilgrims, we invite you to come visit Pilgrim Center of Hope and learn more about our threefold ministry of events, media outreach, and pilgrimage journeys. We are a nonprofit ministry. Join us in this vital mission of evangelization as we guide people to Christ and the Church. You can learn more at pilgrimcenterofhope.org or by calling us at 210-521-3377. Fellow pilgrims, let's strive to live each day with love, faith, courage, and hope. Until next time, may God bless you and safe travels.